You have been holding your breath for so long that you forgot what it felt like to simply exhale. Not the kind of breath you take between arguments, or the shallow one you pull in before you say something careful. Something measured, something designed not to upset the fragile peace you have been tending like a wound. A real breath. The kind that fills the chest all the way down. The kind that belongs to someone who is allowed to take up space. If you cannot remember the last time you breathed like that, this is for you. In today's audiobook, we explore the slow suffocation that lives inside toxic love, the heart of how toxic love suffocates. You, Reclaiming Your Breath and Life, published by Unchained Heart. In these pages, we go beyond the surface, inviting you to sit with what this theme truly means in your own life, not as a diagnosis, not as a checklist, but as a quiet, honest conversation between two women who have both learned what it costs to stay somewhere that slowly takes your air away. This is not a book about dramatic moments. It is not about the screaming or the cruelty that is easy to name. It is about something quieter and far more disorienting, the gradual way that love, when it is the wrong kind, can compress the space around you until you are living in a room that keeps getting smaller, until your thoughts sound like apologies, until your body moves through the world with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been surviving for a very long time without realizing it. You may have come here because you are still inside it, or because you have recently left and you are standing in the strange open air of after, not quite sure what to do with all this unfamiliar space. Or perhaps you left long ago, but something in you still feels constricted, still holds the breath, still waits for the tension, still flinches at a certain tone of voice. Wherever you are, this book was written for exactly this moment. In Chapter 1, we begin at the root, the moment the suffocation starts, before you even know to call it that. We look at how certain relationships establish a kind of atmospheric pressure from the very beginning, and how love can become the very thing that takes your oxygen away. In Chapter 2, we explore how breathlessness becomes ordinary, how the body adapts to chronic tension until tightness feels like normalcy, and you lose the ability to recognize what was taken from you because it was taken so slowly. In Chapter 3, we examine the daily rituals of survival, the routines you built not to thrive, but to manage, to minimize, to move through the hours without triggering something. We name the invisible labor of walking on air. In Chapter 4, we turn to the body itself, the place where everything is stored, where the truth of what you lived is held long after the mind has found its explanations. The body remembers, and it is time to listen to what it has been trying to say. In Chapter 5, we begin the first movements toward reclaiming breath, not in grand gestures, but in the smallest, most honest acts of returning to yourself. The first exhale that is truly yours. And in Chapter 6, we sit with what life begins to feel like when the chest opens again, when you are no longer managing the air, when you are simply, finally, breathing. Let us begin gently at the root of this. Before we go further, if this is the kind of conversation you have been quietly needing, if these words are landing somewhere deep and true, I want to invite you to follow the Unchained Heart channel. Every week, new audiobooks arrive in this same space. Honest, unhurried, written for the woman who is finding her way back to herself. You do not have to look for them. Just follow, and they will find you when you need them. Chapter 1. The moment the air changed. There is a particular memory that many women carry without realizing it is significant. It is not a dramatic memory. It does not involve raised voices or broken objects or the kind of moment that is easy to point to later and say, that was when everything changed. It is quieter than that. It is the first time you adjusted yourself for someone else's comfort, and it cost you something you cannot quite name. Maybe it was the way you softened a sentence before you said it, filing down the honest edges because you had already learned, in some wordless animal way, that certain truths made the room go cold. Maybe it was the first time you felt your body tighten slightly when you heard the key in the door, not from excitement, but from something older and more cautious. Maybe it was a look, a silence that carried weight, a compliment that had a small, sharp thing hidden inside it. You may not have registered it as the beginning of anything. At the time, it felt like ordinary accommodation, the kind of adjustment everyone makes in love, the daily negotiations of two lives fitting together, and perhaps it was, Once. Perhaps there was a version of this relationship that existed before the atmosphere shifted, before the air pressure in the room began to quietly change. But at some point, and this is what is important to name, the adjustment stopped being mutual. The space you were given to be yourself began to contract. Not all at once. Never all at once. It happened the way a tide retreats, slowly, incrementally, in ways that are almost invisible until you notice one day that you are standing very far from where you started, and the water has gone out much farther than you realized. This is how toxic love begins its particular work. Not with cruelty that announces itself, but with a subtle reorganization of the atmosphere, a gradual installation of conditions. Conditions about how you speak, about how much space your feelings are allowed to occupy, about what is acceptable to want, to express, to need, about who you are allowed to be in the presence of this person. Consider the woman who was once known for her laugh, the kind of laugh that arrived without asking permission, that surprised even her. At some point, she began to hear it through someone else's ears, to wonder if it was too much, to pull it back slightly, to make it quieter, more controlled. She did not decide to do this. Nobody told her to. But something in the relational atmosphere communicated, in its own language, that her full presence was somehow excessive. And so she began the slow work of making herself smaller, not because she was asked to, but because she had learned to read the weather of another person's moods with the precision of someone whose comfort depends on accurate forecasting. This is how the suffocation begins, in the small contractions, in the adjustments that are so reasonable seeming, so minor that they never rise to the level of complaint. You do not tell anyone about them because there is nothing dramatic to report. You simply become someone who breathes a little less deeply than you used to. There is something important to understand here, and it requires a kind of compassion toward yourself that may feel unfamiliar. The reason you did not recognize what was happening is not because you were naive or weak. It is because human beings are extraordinarily adaptable. We are built to normalize our environments. We are built to find ways to function within whatever conditions surround us. This capacity for adaptation is, in most circumstances, a profound strength. Inside a relationship that is slowly taking your air, it becomes the very thing that makes the suffocation possible, because you adapt so well that you do not realize you are adapting. You simply live in the new, smaller space and gradually forget the dimensions of the larger one. The moment the air changed may have been years ago, and you may have spent years since then in the adapted state, functioning, managing, surviving, without a clear understanding of what you lost, or when, or how. This chapter is simply an invitation to remember, not to dwell, not to audit all that was taken, but to gently acknowledge there was a before. And the distance between that before and now is the map of everything this book is going to help you begin to reclaim. Chapter 2. How breathlessness became normal. There is a particular quality to chronic constriction that makes it almost impossible to see from the inside. It does not feel like constriction after a while. It feels like personality. It feels like who you are. This is perhaps the most disorienting thing about living inside a toxic relationship for an extended period of time. You eventually lose access to the reference point of your former self. The you who breathed freely, who spoke without rehearsing, who occupied her body without monitoring it, that person begins to feel distant, almost fictional, like someone you read about once rather than someone you actually were. And in her place, a new self forms, a self built for survival. Efficient, careful, attuned to danger, skilled at reading rooms and managing moods, and finding the exact right tone of voice to navigate any given emotional climate. This self is not weak. She is extraordinarily capable. She has developed a sensitivity to other people's inner states that borders on the psychic. She can detect a shift in someone's mood from the sound of their footsteps, from a particular quality of silence, from the way a fork is set down on a plate. She has learned to preempt conflict with such precision that conflict is often avoided entirely, and this feels, from the inside, like skill, like success, like something to be quietly proud of. What is harder to see is the cost of running this system constantly, the cost of always having one part of your nervous system on alert, scanning, assessing, anticipating. The cost of making yourself comfortable enough, safe enough, small enough that the weather in the room stays manageable. This vigilance does not announce itself as exhaustion. It simply becomes the background frequency of daily life. A hum you stop hearing because it is always there. The daily routine inside a suffocating relationship has a particular texture that those who have lived it will recognize immediately. There is the morning assessment, the reading of the atmosphere before the day has even properly begun. Is today a safe day or a careful day? What is the mood? What happened last night that might be carrying forward? There is the calibration of conversation, the internal editing that runs in real time, trimming what you want to say down to what is safe to say, what is unlikely to be misinterpreted, what will not provoke, will not disappoint, will not require you to navigate a response you do not have the energy for. There is the management of your own emotions, the careful internal filing of feelings that are too large or too inconvenient to express, the maintenance of a surface that reads as calm and agreeable, even when what is underneath is a tangle of unexpressed grief, and frustration and longing for something you cannot quite name. There is the performance of contentment, for him sometimes, but more often for the outside world, for the people who would ask questions you are not ready to answer, who would see things you are not yet ready to see yourself. All of this becomes routine. It becomes ordinary. And ordinary feels, after a while, like normal, like simply life. This is where breathlessness becomes invisible, when it is no longer distinguishable from the texture of every day. When you cannot remember a version of daily life that did not include this particular weight, this particular management, this particular quality of holding, it is not that you have forgotten you are suffering. It is that you have reclassified suffering as simply the cost of being alive, the price of loving someone, the reasonable tax that adult life charges on the heart. And yet the body keeps an honest account. Even when the mind has accepted the new normal, even when the emotional self has filed and organized and adapted, the body holds what is true. The tightness in the chest that appears without a clear trigger, the jaw that clenches in sleep, the stomach that tightens in the hours before he arrives home. The inexplicable fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to address, because what you are tired from is not a physical exertion, but the continuous, invisible labor of existing in a compressed space. This chapter asks you to do something that requires a particular kind of courage. It asks you to look at your ordinary and wonder whether ordinary is, in fact, okay. Not in judgment, not in urgency, but with the quiet, honest curiosity of someone who suspects that what has been normalized does not deserve to be normal. And to sit gently with that question and let it breathe. Chapter 3. The invisible labor of walking on air. There is a phrase that most people understand as something light, walking on air. In its common usage, it means joy, elation, the feeling of being lifted by something wonderful. But inside a suffocating relationship, walking on air means something entirely different. It means the constant, exhausting work of moving through your own home, your own life, your own days without making a sound that disturbs the fragile equilibrium. It means the particular art of existing lightly enough that you do not trigger what you have learned to fear. This labor is invisible because it produces nothing visible. There is no artifact of it. There is no record of the sentences you edited before they left your mouth, the needs you quietly buried before they became requests, the versions of yourself you set aside because this moment, this day, this mood did not have room for them. Nobody sees the work it takes to be this careful. And because it is invisible, it is also, for a long time, unacknowledged, even by you. The invisible labor of a suffocating relationship lives in the routines. It lives in the way you plan what to say before a difficult conversation, with the precision of someone preparing a legal brief, anticipating objections, softening language, preemptively apologizing for things that have not yet been said. It lives in the way you check his face before you laugh at something, because you have learned that your joy sometimes has a particular effect on his mood, and you are not always certain which effect it will be. It lives in the way you have quietly reorganized your friendships, letting certain ones go slack, allowing certain intimacies to thin, because maintaining them required an energy you no longer have, or because they asked questions that made you uncomfortable, or because his discomfort with them was simply easier to absorb than the friction of keeping them. It lives in the way you cook, in the way you dress, in the way you time your arrivals and departures, in the way you have learned, with almost unconscious precision, the exact temperature of his moods at different times of day, in different situations, after different kinds of interactions with the world. You have become, without choosing to, an expert in one person's emotional climate, and you have organized your entire daily existence around maintaining conditions that keep that climate manageable. This is not love. Or rather, this is not only love. This is survival. And the two have become so entangled for so long that you may genuinely no longer know where one ends and the other begins. You may have told yourself that this attentiveness is care, that this vigilance is devotion, that the management of someone else's emotional world is simply what it means to be a good partner. And there is a particular tragedy in this reframing because it took one of your greatest capacities, your deep sensitivity and attunement to others, and put it entirely in service of one person's comfort, at the continuous expense of your own. What does it cost, all this walking on air? It costs you presence. The kind of presence that allows you to be genuinely inside your own life, rather than managing it from a slight distance. It costs you spontaneity, the ability to feel something and simply let it move through you without first assessing whether it is acceptable. It costs you the particular kind of rest that comes from being in a space where you do not have to monitor the atmosphere, where you can simply be. There is a certain loneliness that belongs specifically to this experience. The loneliness of having no one to tell the real version to. The loneliness of sitting across from someone you have organized your entire life around and feeling, underneath the performance of normalcy, profoundly unseen. Because the person who is seen in this relationship is not you. It is the version of you that you have carefully constructed for this environment, the one who is manageable enough, quiet enough, small enough to be acceptable. The real you has been waiting, somewhere underneath all that careful management, for a very long time. Chapter 4. What the body has been holding the mind is a generous editor. It takes the raw, unprocessed experience of living inside a suffocating relationship and works on it continuously, finding explanations, manufacturing justifications, building narratives that allow you to continue functioning, to continue loving, to continue. The mind is skilled at this. It is, in many ways, trying to protect you. It files the difficult things in folders labeled later and context, and it was not that bad. It is good at its work. The body is not an editor. The body is a witness. Everything that the mind has processed and stored and explained and rationalized, the body holds in its original form. The body does not have access to the explanations. It only has access to the experience. And so while the mind has found its accommodations, the body carries the unredacted version, the fear that was never discharged, the grief that was never allowed to move, the anger that was turned inward because there was nowhere safe for it to go. The longing that has been present for so long, it has become structural, like something load-bearing inside the chest. This is why the exhaustion of a suffocating relationship does not resolve with sleep. Why the anxiety that lives in your body does not have a clear object. It is not about anything specific. It is simply present, like weather. Why you can be, by any external measure, safe and still feel, in the body, like something is about to happen. The body learned to live on alert. The body adapted to chronic uncertainty the way all living things adapt to chronic conditions, by reorganizing itself around them. And this reorganization does not simply undo itself when the conditions change. The body needs something different. It needs acknowledgement. It needs to be heard. Consider what the body absorbed over months, over years of this kind of living. Every moment of tension that was swallowed rather than expressed left a small residue. Every argument that ended not with resolution, but with the silencing of one voice deposited something in the tissue, in the muscles, in the held breath. Every night of lying awake in the particular alertness of someone who's nervous, system does not fully trust its environment left its mark. Every time you felt afraid and had no language for the fear, no permission for it, nowhere to put it, the body stored it. This is not metaphor. Those who work closely with the body's experience of trauma and chronic stress observe consistently that what cannot be expressed outwardly gets expressed inwardly. The jaw holds what the mouth could not say. The shoulders carry the weight of what the mind did not allow itself to know. The stomach contracts around the truth that the rest of you is not ready to acknowledge. The breath stays shallow, not because anything is physically wrong, but because the body learned long ago in this relationship that a full breath was a kind of risk, that expanding fully took up too much space, that being fully present in your own body was not entirely safe. If you have lived inside a suffocating relationship, you may recognize some of this in your own body without needing to understand it intellectually. The chronic tightness that has no clear cause, the headaches that arrive in certain emotional climates, the particular quality of fatigue that feels heavier than tired, more like carrying something than simply needing rest. The way your body sometimes reacts to certain sounds, certain tones of voice, certain kinds of silence, with a response that is disproportionate to the immediate situation, because it is not responding to the immediate situation alone. It is responding to the archive. What the body needs in the long process of reclaiming breath is not to be fixed or managed or pushed past. It needs to be included. It needs to be listened to with the same patience and seriousness you have spent years extending to someone else. The tension in your chest is information. The constriction in your throat is a sentence that has not yet been spoken. The exhaustion is real, and it is telling you something true about the weight you have been carrying. This is not the chapter where the body heals. Healing is not a chapter. It is a long, non-linear process that happens in its own time. But this is the chapter where you stop treating the body as a problem to be managed and begin to consider it as a witness to be honored. It has been keeping an honest account, and you are ready now to begin to read it. Before we move into the final chapters, into the first movements of reclaiming yourself, I want to let you know that Unchained Heart has many other audiobooks in this same healing universe. If these words have found you today, there is more waiting for you. Stories of identity, of boundaries, of learning to trust yourself again, of the long and private work of coming back. Subscribe to Unchained Heart and turn on notifications so these conversations continue to find you when you need them most. Chapter 5. The first exhale that is truly yours, reclaiming breath, does not happen the way you might imagine it. It does not arrive as a revelation. There is no single moment where everything clarifies and the constriction lifts and you are suddenly entirely free. That is the story we are told about healing, the dramatic turning point, the moment of transformation, and it is almost never how it actually works. What actually happens is quieter, more incremental, more ordinary. It begins for most women with a moment of recognition. Not an external event, but an internal one. A moment when something you have been telling yourself no longer quite holds. A small, private collapse of a particular story. Maybe it happens in a mundane moment, standing in the kitchen or sitting in a car, or lying awake at 3 a.m, and something shifts. Not everything, just a layer. Just enough that you feel, briefly, the difference between the constructed self you have been inhabiting and something older, more honest, underneath. These moments are easy to dismiss. The mind moves quickly to cover them with explanations, with the next task, with the familiar comforts of the narrative you have been maintaining. But something has been seen, and once something has been seen, it is harder to fully unsee. The first movements toward reclaiming yourself are not about leaving or confronting or making grand declarations. They are about noticing, about beginning to track, with honest attention, what in your daily life actually belongs to you, what arises from your own desires, your own preferences, your own authentic response to the world, versus what has been calibrated entirely for someone else's comfort. This distinction, which may sound obvious, is genuinely difficult to make when you have been inside a suffocating relationship for a long time, because the calibration has become so automatic, so seamless, that it is no longer distinguishable from simply being you, So it begins with small recoveries. A moment when you notice that you prefer silence and you allow yourself to have it without guilt. A meal you make because you want it, not because it will be received well. A sentence you say that is honest rather than careful, that carries your real thought rather than the edited version, and you feel, in the aftermath, both frightened and strangely alive. A piece of music you loved and stopped listening to because it did not belong in this emotional climate, and you put it on, alone, and let it move through you, and something loosens. These small recoveries are not trivial. They are the building blocks of a self that is genuinely yours. Each one is an act of remembering, a reaching back toward the person you were before the air changed, and finding her still there, still present, still capable of preference and desire and genuine response to the world. There is a particular courage required for this work, not the dramatic courage of a single decisive act, but the quieter, harder courage of sustained honesty. The courage to keep noticing even when noticing is uncomfortable. To keep choosing your own authentic response, even in the small moments when the old pattern pulls strongly, to stay with the discomfort of beginning to breathe again, because re-expansion, after a long constriction, can itself feel threatening. There is a kind of withdrawal from hypervigilance, from the constant management of the relational atmosphere that can feel, at first, like something is wrong rather than something is healing. This is important to name because it is one of the reasons people return to suffocating relationships even when they have begun to find their way out. Not because they do not know better or because they do not deserve more, but because the constriction has become, in a very real physiological sense, familiar. And familiar registers as safe even when it is not. The openness, the actual freedom can feel initially like danger, like too much air, like a space too large to trust. The first exhale that is truly yours will not feel like freedom immediately. It will feel like something more complicated than that. It will feel like the first breath after surfacing from deep water, relief and disorientation, and the strange vulnerability of lungs that are actually full. Be patient with this. This is what beginning actually feels like. Chapter 6. What it feels like when the heart is finally free. There is a quality of life that becomes available on the other side of a suffocating relationship that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not lived the suffocation. Not because it is extraordinary, but precisely because it is ordinary in a way that had been foreclosed. The ordinariness of a Tuesday, of a morning that begins without the atmospheric assessment, of an evening that does not need to be navigated, of sitting in your own kitchen and feeling nothing in particular. Not managed contentment, not performed ease, just the quiet, unremarkable experience of being somewhere safe, of being, for once, simply where you are. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. When you have spent months or years in a relationship that required you to be perpetually managing the emotional climate, perpetually attuned, perpetually careful, perpetually editing and monitoring and adjusting, the absence of that requirement is itself a kind of revelation, not because something wonderful has been added to your life, but because something exhausting has been removed. And what remains in the space where the vigilance used to live is a particular quality of quiet that you may not have experienced in so long that you have forgotten its name. The name for it is simply peace, not the performed peace of a surface that has been smoothed out for someone else's comfort, not the temporary peace of a conflict that has been successfully avoided, but the actual peace of a nervous system that is no longer on alert, a body that has begun to trust its environment, a self that is no longer spending its primary energy on management. Women who have come through this territory describe noticing specific things, the way they laugh differently, more fully, more freely, without the small internal check that had become so habitual they stopped noticing it, the way they speak, hearing their own voice as something that belongs to them again, that says what it means rather than what is safe. The way they inhabit their bodies, with less vigilance, with a kind of ease that is almost physical, like muscles that have been held tight for a long time finally releasing. The way they make decisions, from their own knowing, their own preference, their own sense of what is true for them, rather than from a constant calculation of what will be acceptable to someone else. There is also grief here. It would be dishonest not to name it. Because what you were reclaiming was real. The years inside a suffocating relationship were real years. Years of your life, years of your becoming. And whatever was lost in them, whatever version of yourself was compressed or set aside or quietly erased, deserves to be mourned. This grief is not weakness. It is the appropriate response to a real loss. And it can exist alongside the relief, alongside the reclaiming, alongside the first genuine breaths of freedom. Grief and liberation are not opposites. They often travel together. What life feels like when the heart is finally free is not a permanent state of elation. It is not the motivational poster version of healing. The woman standing on a cliff with her arms open, the wind in her hair, the triumphant music swelling. It is something more textured than that, more honest, more sustainable. It is the quiet pleasure of your own company, the discovery that you have preferences you had forgotten. The particular satisfaction of a conversation in which you said exactly what you meant and the sky did not fall. The experience of a conflict that resolved without anyone disappearing or collapsing, or the whole relational structure threatening to come apart. The slow, genuine surprise of discovering that you are, in fact, good company for yourself. That the self you were so carefully managing and minimizing for so long is, when given room to breathe, someone you genuinely like. This is what reclaiming your breath ultimately means. Not the dramatic liberation, not the triumphant reinvention, but the quiet, daily, growing experience of being genuinely inside your own life, of breathing all the way down, of taking up, finally and without apology, exactly the space that was always yours. Throughout these chapters, we have sat with the slow, private reality of what it means to have your breath taken from you by love, how it begins imperceptibly, how it becomes routine, how it lives in the body, how the invisible labor accumulates, and how the long way back begins not with grand gestures, but with small, honest recoveries. What does this mean for where you are right now? Perhaps you are still inside the suffocation, and something in these words has named what you could not name. Perhaps you are in the difficult middle territory, outside the relationship, but still carrying its atmosphere. Still flinching at nothing, still breathing more shallowly than you need to. Perhaps you are further along. And this was simply a homecoming, a recognition of a territory you have already quietly been navigating. Wherever you are, this is true. The breath has not been permanently taken. It has been held. And the holding is not who you are. It is what you learned to do in conditions that required it. The conditions can change. You are allowed to exhale. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to live in a room where the air is not being managed, where the atmosphere does not need to be monitored, where you can exist in the full dimensions of who you are without adjustment, without apology, without the constant quiet labor of making yourself small enough to be acceptable. You have carried this long enough. The tightness in your chest knows what it has been holding, and somewhere underneath all the careful adaptation, the original you, the one who breathed freely, who laughed without checking, who occupied her own body without monitoring it. She is still there. She has been waiting with extraordinary patience. She is ready, whenever you are, to breathe again. You are not carrying this alone anymore. If these words have stayed with you, if something in this audiobook has quietly named what you have been living, I want to invite you one more time to follow the Unchained Heart channel. Every week, new conversations arrive in this same space. Honest, unhurried. Written for the woman who is making her slow and courageous way back to herself. Follow the channel and let us continue this journey together, at whatever pace yours requires. End of the audiobook.